Well, I think we will get started. It's a pretty full room in here this evening, and so we may have another body or two that can come in, but hopefully there's still some space. So I just want to say welcome. This is our second installment of what we are calling our Scholars in the Square series. My name is Rachel Brown, and I'm the Program and Research Coordinator of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. Because our esteemed director, Paul Bramadat, has another role for this evening, I have the privilege of being the host tonight. So I'd like to begin by saying that we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Our speaker this evening will be discussing embodied spiritualities, issues of appropriation and trauma, and so it's essential for us to acknowledge the ways that our meeting here tonight on Lekwungen lands is deeply tied to these issues as well. So the new Scholars in the Square format combines the very best of the CSRS, cutting-edge research from established and emerging academics, warm and respectful conversations with peers, and open engagement with the larger world. As a reminder, this evening will unfold as follows. We'll have a 20-minute talk by an expert, followed by a 20-minute period of discussion between the speaker, the host, and another friendly commentator who is familiar with the speaker's topic, followed finally by open conversation with the normally 20 people in the room, but a few more today, as well as those who have joined us through the miracle of Zoom. So we're hosting this series in a room that has been specifically designed for this kind of hybrid engagement, yet we are always surprised how things can unfold differently. So our apologies to those who joined us last week on Zoom and didn't have a chance to have their questions heard in the room. We're hoping that this week we can take questions from the Zoom audience through direct message to Scott. So look for Scott's name on the Zoom chat and directly send your Q&A to him. So as the conversation unfolds, please do make notes of your questions that you'd like to pose and send them directly to Scott. Now, throughout the year, we'll feature research from all over the intellectual map and the actual map. And if you're interested in what we do have in store for this year, please do take a look at our newsletter or our website. We also will have a few regular sort of in-person public lectures as well, and you can find the information for those on that site as well. And so now, without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for this evening, someone who is probably familiar to all in the room and requires very little introduction, but I've been tasked with it anyway. So our very own CSRS director, Paul Bramadat. Paul is professor of religion, culture, and society and history, and director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society here at UVic. His research and writing has covered vast topics and generally explores the ways we imagine religion and spirituality when we talk about things like diversity, health, security, regionalism, civil society. Most of his many articles, book chapters, edited volumes, and monographs explore religion, spirituality, and secularity in North America and Western Europe. And recently, he's become increasingly interested in the relationships between these societies and global forces. His CV is impressively long, including both sole-authored books and articles, as well as many center-based international and interdisciplinary edited volumes. A few of my favorites, because I get to pick favorites in this role, are the following edited volumes that Paul edited with colleagues from around the world and across many disciplinary boundaries. There's Religion at the Edge, Nature, Spirituality, and Secularity in the Pacific Northwest with UBC. Urban Religious Events, Public Spirituality in Contested Spaces with Bloomsbury Press, and Public Health in the Age of Anxiety, Religious and Cultural Roots of Vaccine Hesitancy with U of T. His first book, published with Oxford, The Church on the World's Turf, became essential reading for all Canadian religious studies graduate students and was foundational to my own thinking about how to do ethnography and how to do it well. I'm sure that the book that he has just completed on contemporary postural yoga in North America, on which his talk tonight is based, will also be field-changing and will impact the next generation of RS scholars in the way that the Church on the World's Turf did mine. As I said just a moment ago, the second part of the Scholars in the Square format features a conversation between the speaker, the host, and a friendly colleague. Tonight, our friendly conversation partner will be Leah Myrna. Leah is a PhD candidate in anthropology, is the RA on the Yoga Project, and was in the field with Paul for 5 out of the 6 cities that he visited. Leah has become a key interlocutor for Paul on the topic of contemporary yoga and has a deep understanding of the project, so she was an ideal choice for this role. I actually had the privilege of accompanying Paul to the 6th city, and so I may take host privileges and ask some of my own questions during the second 20 minutes as well. And so with that, I'm thrilled to turn the room over to Paul.
Wow, that was an excellent introduction. Way better than mine. Thanks very much, Rachel. That's great. I'm really looking forward to talking with Rachel and Leah afterwards. They were really quite central to the way the research unfolded, and I think have really made the book that has been produced much stronger. So thanks for being here, and thanks for taking on this role. So I want to give you a bit of a sneak preview of what's in the book. So the book is about modern postural yoga. Just to be clear, we're not talking about meditative forms of yoga. We're talking really about the third of Patanjali's 8 limbs. Of course, you know, postural yoga practitioners will experience the 8 limbs in their practice all the time, but we're going to be focusing really on asana-based practice. So there we go. Just to give you a bit of a quick sketch of what we did in the project. So it was a SSHRC-funded project. It actually has another couple of years to go. But in the process of our fieldwork, we interviewed 83 teachers, long interviews, 12 focus groups with 43 students. We did 34 additional interviews with teachers and students, and a ton of participant observation in 7 different North American cities. They're listed there. They're kind of paired, actually. So Vancouver and LA, Winnipeg and Indianapolis, Toronto and New York. Victoria is kind of a bonus city because we live here, and it was easy to do a kind of a pilot project here. But you can kind of imagine that they're paired so that we can make some national comparisons. We did 65 classes of a whole range of styles, everything from Ashtanga to Iyengar to we did some yin, some restorative, some kind of fitness club type yoga, and a lot of hot yoga, maybe more hot yoga than I ever imagined we would do. So we also did a survey with 650 people from Canada and the United States. It's not a massive N, but actually the data did reflect more or less what we kind of expected it might, so that was quite interesting. Now when you're in the field as an ethnographer, you have to pay attention to the things people are telling you. And people kept talking about the TT experience, the yoga teacher training programs that almost all teachers take and almost all sort of very advanced students take. And so when we returned from the field, I decided I would take one of these TTs. And so I enrolled in one which lasted from March to June. So I found an extra 50 hours per month to take this program. And it was really, really a great program. And it really has sort of thickened my sense of what's going on in the field. So it's probably important, I think, to mention, not important, but it's going to be part of the conversation, that I have a pretty serious personal practice. I think Rachel would describe it as fanatical. It's been happening for about 10 years. About 6 times a week, I go to a studio downtown Victoria for about 90 minutes each day at about 6 o'clock in the morning. So yeah, it's Ashtanga. That's the traditional name for this particular style of yoga. In addition to that personal practice, I've been to 7 workshops around the Cascadia region on various aspects of yoga. And I've been super fortunate to be part of the AAR's Yoga Studies Network, where I've learned so much from the students and faculty members in that community. So I really want to thank them for really helping to educate me on these things. And whenever I'm abroad, or even at a conference in Canada, I try to practice at whatever studio is kind of closest to my Airbnb or hotel. It's also probably relevant to mention that I come from mixed race backgrounds. My father was Indo-Trinidadian, so this was just a kind of a fact when I entered the field, but it became a more central component of my analysis as I began to think about what I was experiencing and feeling, and some of the mixed feelings I had about cultural appropriation and all these kinds of things. So this will show up in the book. So just to give you some sense of how things began, over the last 5 to 10 years, many people in Canada have become extremely aware of how different our society is from our southern neighbors. So I went into the field initially looking to trace whether or not those social institutional political differences between Canada and the United States might shape or inform or influence what happens in a yoga studio. Okay, so it kind of had a sociological political science bent to it initially when I went into the field. And, you know, that did end up being, you know, evident in the field, the influence of these kind of big American Canadian differences. So I'm thinking about differences around healthcare, gun control, the autonomy of women over their bodies, just different senses of how to deal with the history of slavery in the United States and the history of Indigenous violence in Canada and reconciliation issues. So I was looking for those kinds of things. Again, I found them, and that's throughout the book. But it actually, you know, didn't turn out to be quite as interesting or definitive or determinative as I thought those forces would be. And so the national dilemma, the national layer didn't turn out to be quite as definitive as I thought it would be. So when it came time to actually write the book, I sort of approached it from a sort of a broader perspective. And so the book's chapters, the book is called, by the way, Yoga for Adults, Subtle Bodies in a Coarse World. We can maybe get to the title later on. So the book's chapters include a chapter on the claim, the very common claim that yoga is spiritual but not religious. A chapter on the special powers that are thought to be developed in serious yogis. Cultural appropriation, of course, was a central consideration. I actually thought it was going to be a much bigger concern among the people I interviewed than it actually turned out to be. There wasn't much charge around it, actually. The sexual abuse scandals, the kind of yoga's Me Too moment or period or scandals, really were of great interest to me. And then, again, the national layer of influence was definitely kind of always on the table, even if it wasn't definitive. But today, I want to talk about two other chapters on two other topics. Just to give you a bit of a sketch, I'm going to spend a lot more time on the first one than on this second one. The first one, yoga and politics, I mean that in both the capital P and the small p sense, and the second one was on yoga and trauma, which turned out to be a way bigger theme or set of experiences than I thought it would be. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about two very common claims that are often made about politics and yoga by insiders, by practitioners, and by critics. So first claim is that modern postural yoga should have nothing to do with politics, because here yoga is imagined as good, innocent, pure, transcendent, metaphysical, spiritual, whereas politics is imagined as bad, corrupt, grubby, you know, realpolitik and so forth. And the second claim is quite on the opposite end of the spectrum, which is that modern postural yoga is entirely political, by which people mean all the bad stuff about politics. So I'm going to take you to these claims in turn, and then offer kind of a third way. So why might people say yoga should be apolitical? So that's a normative claim, not just that it is, but it should be. You could trace that back to the Yoga Sutras themselves. You know, unlike, for example, the Gospels or other biblical texts, the Yoga Sutras aren't really about social justice or taxation, or, you know, it's not really what they're oriented toward. They're really much more about the individual managing their own mind and finding a way to release themselves from all the clutches of the material world and all the various dilemmas that we find in the mind. So you could say that if you go back to what's sometimes called the Bible of yoga, the Yoga Sutras, you don't find a lot of capital P political or even small p political oriented. So you can make a different argument, but I think this is one of the key arguments for this claim. The second reason people say it should be apolitical is, I think, related to something like Orientalism. By that I mean, we love the idea that sometime in some place, you know, far away and long ago, there were people who were different, like fundamentally different. They woke up every morning and they just thought sacred thoughts and transcendent thoughts, and we weren't concerned about anything other than freeing their minds. And the other one, married to this, I think, this is a kind of a weird mirror and a reflection of the failures of our own society. So we love the idea that while our society is grubby and materialistic and so forth, there was a time over there and long ago when people were fundamentally spiritual. You can probably tell from my tone that I don't really buy this, but you know, it's a significant part of this argument, so we have to take it seriously. So the second claim is that yoga is fundamentally political. It's only political. And there's really kind of three, I guess, strands of this claim or this argument. First, it's not an accident that the largest, most expensive house in British Columbia, at least as far as I can recall, is owned by Chip Wilson, who was the guy who was behind Lululemon. Right, so yoga, since it really began being very popular in the United States and Canada, let's say kind of 80s, 90s, had no problem adjusting to capitalism. And capitalism just thought, awesome, we can definitely use this. And it did. So, you know, the key part of this claim here is that yoga is really at home in capitalism. The second part of the claim is that while people might sometimes say they're in it for the spiritual elevation or spiritual benefits, it's fundamentally about that woman in that right-hand picture, just being more awesome than she already is. That there's a kind of a narcissism that is hidden in otherwise spiritual claims. That's the second part of this claim. The third part of this claim is that yoga protects white privilege. That while there's some kind of a nod in the direction of yoga's Indic origins, that the way yoga is packaged and the way yoga is kind of unfolded in the West is a way to maintain the power of white folks to just sort of pick and choose whatever they feel like around the world. So those are the two claims. I'm suspicious of this one too, but we'll get to that suspicion later. So these claims are useful interventions, and I think we need to take them very seriously. They actually, using those critiques, those two claims, is very helpful. It helps us see things we wouldn't otherwise see, and I think I have a lot of respect for those claims. But I don't think you need to choose. I think, in some sense, we can see that in many aspects of, especially modern functional yoga, that there's a kind of an ambiguity of the ways in which yoga is political. So I just want to give you 5 very quick examples. I'm going to say that they're arranged from the gross to the subtle. This is a kind of a classic yogic contrast. Because I kind of want to argue that really yoga and politics are bound together because, you know, everything is political. Even things in your own imagination are inflected by, influenced by your social location, your class, race, gender, national origin, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no way to get around or away from political. So let's just think about some of the ambiguities of the history of yoga's capital P and small p political presence. So the first one, that's Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, leading a yoga class. I think that's probably the International Day of Yoga, probably in Delhi. And so many people know that Modi, about 10 years ago, decided, you know, took a look around the world and said, holy crow, people seem to really like this yoga thing. And he found a way, totally understandable. If I was a politician, I would have done exactly the same thing. I don't see that in my future, so it's not safe to say that. He found a way to sort of opportunistically remind people around the world and people in India that yoga has this Indic origin. Again, that seems unproblematic. That's historically true, of course. But if you happen to be somebody in India who's not a yoga practitioner, if you're one of, let's say, some of the 200 million Muslims who live there who might not practice yoga, who might not identify themselves as yoga practitioners, and that being the fundamental feature of your Indianness, you might kind of not be so crazy about that particular kind of messaging. So it's ambiguous. This I'm not going to get into at length. I'm just going to observe that the Common Yoga Protocol, which is a production of the government essentially, is this fascinating attempt by the Indian state to articulate what yoga is, where it's from, what it's for, how you should be thinking of it and practicing it as you're practicing it. And so for a secular state to be, and that's, I put that in quotation marks, of course, but for an officially secular state to be making these kinds of claims and to be linking them to capital R religious ideas and concepts is really quite interesting. You just can't imagine Denmark or Canada doing this. Again, this, in my view, is kind of just ambiguous. It's just worth thinking critically about, because I don't really take any exception to the core claims here. I just think it's worth thinking about how this happens. Some of you know I've written an article on this. I'm not going to go into great depth on this, but we have our own examples of capital P politician, opportunistically using yoga to advance her political fortunes. And poor Christy Clark, who really thought fairly naively in retrospect that this was a kind of a win-win scenario, that it would be a great photo op on the Burrard Street Bridge. She'd close it down for a few hours on a Sunday, June 21st, which was the very first International Day of Yoga. And she wanted to have the largest yoga class in the world in Vancouver. And this, again, seemed like sort of pretty lovely. And then the public backlash was immediate and it was ferocious. And within a week, she canceled it. So all that to say, you don't have to look very far to find example after example of people in political contexts using yoga or being involved in yoga. The entanglements are deep. In the United States, we don't have time to talk about this much, but in the United States, there was a court case around whether or not it was a Joyce Foundation, which is a foundation that promotes Ashtanga yoga. And they supported a program in a particular California school district to introduce kids to yoga. And again, this seems like a sweet and lovely thing. What's wrong with little kids doing yoga? Well, you can just imagine that in California, or just in the United States especially, some parents objected to this, and it got into the courts, and ultimately it was decided in favor of the Joyce Foundation to continue to do this. But it was another reminder of the way in which, our definition of what is religious and what is cultural and what is exercise oriented, it was very fluid and controversial. And the people who lost on appeal were not very happy they lost, as you can well imagine. The second last example is that some of you may know that there is yoga in many jails in North America. Again, this seems uncontroversial, actually. Like, why wouldn't we support people getting stretchy and calm and doing some physical activity in jails? That seems kind of unproblematic, except if you feel like, the United States especially is their particularly private form of jailing is problematic, then what you want to be suspicious of is anything that turns down the frustration. If you're just making docile prisoners, you're maybe never going to look closely at how problematic the prison system itself is, or the industry is. So there are people who are, again, appreciative of the physical benefits of yoga, who nonetheless say, well, is there any way to teach yoga in jails that might, on the one hand, calm people down, which again is an inherent good, but also help them understand how they got there in the first place. And then finally, yoga is all over the wellness culture. It's an inherent part of the wellness culture right now. You can't really think about wellness without thinking about yoga anymore. And, again, this is also unproblematic, it seems, because, if you're going to get a facial or a back rub or have your fingernails painted, as Abby talked last week, and you're also going to do yoga because these are bodily practices. Again, what is the problem with that? Again, some critics, so Andrea Jane, who's a colleague and someone who's really a significant player in the yoga studies world, says again, look, the primary objective in most studio contexts is personal improvement, not revolution or social change. So why do we maybe expect it? Well, again, her critique would be similar to the jail critique, which is to say, if all we're doing is turning down the frustration level in grouchy neoliberal victims or victims of neoliberalism, then it's something to think about, something to wonder about. So I'm going to spend less time on the trauma chapter. But, Leah and Rachel and I went into the field expecting to find, and again, we did find, but expecting to find a lot of evidence of big national differences, especially around healthcare and women's autonomy. So we found some of that. But I think Leah and Rachel would agree that we were both struck, and we were all struck by just how much more prominent were all the stories we heard about trauma. It was just profound, overwhelming, really moving, and actually very jarring to hear story after story of car accidents, sexual assault, racism, bullying, divorce, bankruptcy, every kind of addiction you can possibly imagine we heard about. suicide attempts. We just heard a ton of these terrible stories. And these are, we would hear these stories in response to like, well, why do you do X kind of yoga? And people would say, well, you know, I was addicted to cocaine and I was abused by so-and-so. And this to me struck me as a much more profound and kind of unifying experience than the national level of institutional impact. So if you Google trauma-informed ... you get 170 million hits. So there's trauma-informed coaching, pedagogy. I'm sure there's trauma-informed committee leadership. There's trauma-informed everything. And there's trauma-informed yoga. It's actually really a powerful component of the yoga world. Part of the argument here is that our societies are traumatogenic. There's a psychiatrist, Mark Epstein, who wrote a book called The Trauma of Everyday Life. So we're not just talking about the car accident or the sexual assault or the big single bad thing that happened to you, but rather the impact on our bodies and our minds of structural facts in which we live. So healthcare, populism, civil war, government implosion, and so forth. There's a very famous book that was mentioned quite a few times in fieldwork and is mentioned all over yoga land, where I live parts of each day, which is The Body Keeps the Score by another psychiatrist, Bessel. So a brilliant book. The title kind of gives you the whole thesis. And the idea is that all the traumas we experience, the big bad single ones and the structural ones, live in our bodies. And so in my experience and the interviews we conducted suggested that yoga is a kind of a practice that creates ritualized spaces where people learn to use their bodies to heal, to transcend, to use the same body and spirit to manage the traumas that have landed in their bodies. This is a final thought that really was a very profound moment in one of the interviews we did. We were talking to an Indian philosopher and we were saying, hey, well, what do you think about all this trauma-informed yoga stuff? And he said, well, he gets it. He said trauma is a ubiquitous experience. He appreciates why people want to deal with it through yoga. But he said this trauma-informed yoga talk is nonsense because you shouldn't inform your yoga by trauma. Your yoga should inform your trauma. So what he says is he prefers yoga-informed trauma, by which he means, look, if you have a deep, embodied, settled, mature yoga practice, when you do experience trauma, which you 100% will, the trauma, it's not that it doesn't land, it just doesn't land and live as profoundly in your body. So I thought that was quite an interesting spin. He, of course, would define yoga in this case, not just as asana practice, just to remind you that for him, it's the full 8 limbs. So this was a very profound moment. So by way of a conclusion, so on politics, I think yoga spaces frame themselves as kind of anti-world. They're all alternative to the sort of status quo that we are born into, that many people experience as loud, fast, and dirty. But of course, you know, it's still part of the world. And so you should not be surprised to find all of the normal stuff you find in the world inside yoga spaces. Patriarchy, capitalism, all the normal stuff we find everywhere. But nonetheless, there is an effort to create an alternative. On the question of trauma, I think yoga reflects both, on the one hand, just a profoundly widespread experience of trauma in the world, and a desperate need to involve the body in its own healing, not to make all management of your trauma cognitive or cerebral, but to involve the body. And then finally, to make it more sociological toward the end, I think it reflects the inadequacy of the existing resources in both Canada and the United States for dealing with the origins and the effects of trauma. And so my hope is that the book helps us understand the ways postural yoga is both a child and a critic of the world in which it's taken root. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to be here and then.
All right, so we're moving into the second part, which is a conversation, maybe for 15 minutes. So we will.
Your introduction was too long.
No, that was it. I specifically want it wasn't too long. So we're going to head into the conversation. So I'll hand it over to Leah to begin, and then we will open up to broader conversation after. So Leah.
Perfect. Well, thank you. And I'm struck again that I have just about the best research assistant job ever. This has been such a fun project, and it's fun to, re-enter that space and think more about it. I guess thinking broad level first, I do want to hear more about yoga for adults. Like you mentioned that a little bit, and I think that captures a lot of what you're talking about, but maybe is sort of confusing. Like, what do you mean when you call this book Yoga for Adults?
Yeah, thank you. I think what I'm getting at with that title is that, for people who are curious about yoga, intellectually, philosophically, historically, they're going to hit this point where they have to reconcile between what they're learning, let's say, through yoga studies, and what they might be experiencing in a student. And this is for the most of my academic life, I've been pretty comfortably an outsider to the things I've been studying, and now I'm definitely an insider. And so the question is, when you're thinking carefully about a thing that you're an insider of, how do you do that and still maintain your love of this insider thing? So the way I think of it is that the book is in some sense about how to think dispassionately about something you love passionately.
And so is that something that, so you that are kind of in both worlds, that's something you have to balance. I guess I'm thinking of the people that you practice yoga with at 6 a.m. for 90 minutes every morning. Like, how much is that something that you would wish for them to take on or to think more critically? Do they need to think about this politics? Should they not? Like, how do you see that for the average yoga practitioner?
Yeah.
Or is it just you because you're weird?
Yeah.
In this combination, in this combination, because you've told stories too in the past about entering into these yoga spaces and asking questions afterwards where the yoga teacher's like, obviously you're a religious studies professor, like no one else cares about this, thinks about this, right? That's what I mean by you're weird.
No,
like
no.
I'm weird. Yeah.
I'm weird, there's no question. No, I guess it's maybe an academic conceit with that many of us in this room and on Zoom share that we think everyone else should be interested in the stuff we're interested in, and that everybody else should walk into a shopping mall or a church or university classroom and have all the same questions about social structure and the history of the format, like why do we have tables like this and why am I at the front, and that everybody would have that kind of critical orientation. And it's quite clear, as Rachel said, and as you witnessed, that some people just don't. They just don't care. They don't care if they mispronounce words or if they put a greeting like namaste at the end of almost every class in North America. And partly I'm curious about how it comes to pass that people don't care. So that when people find out that namaste is a greeting, not a way to say take care, have a good day, they still do it at the end of class. And you and I had this conversation once, and you just said, well, I think you said that your sense was that people just expect that. It's just part of the ritual. Just like hi, goodbye, or how are you? I don't really expect you to answer how are you when I say how are you. It's just a part of the social ritual we do every morning if we see each other.
Yeah, and now you're an insider in another way where you just took a teacher training, and even since doing the fieldwork. So I haven't talked to you much about this at all, but I'm curious, thinking about maybe how you would teach a class, or like, how does this reflect that, I guess?
Yeah. Well, if I was to teach a class, I would want to give students little doors or windows into other possibilities. They're probably just there. Many of the people who would take a class I would teach are there to fix their bodies or calm their minds. And so I get that, and I wouldn't want to say, well, I'm going to spend half of this class talking about the history of postural yoga or Vivekananda or anything like that. Because that's not what students are there for. But I nonetheless want to make it at least possible for people to enter into the practice at a higher level. And in most teacher trainings, that's what you're taught, is that, look, you're principally there to help people manage asana development. But if and or when they ask you after class, hey, what's the deal with that Shiva question? Or if they ask you about chakras or anything else, that you have an answer that opens the door for them. And I would just want to open the door in a responsible, historically, sociologically, conscientious manner.
Yeah, and I'm curious. So we talked to a lot of teachers throughout the fieldwork about different parts of their teacher experience, things they learned, things they liked, things they didn't. And I'm curious, now that you've done a teacher training, how much of that either corroborated what teachers were saying when we were talking to them, or did you have an experience that was different?
What do you have in mind about what they learned or didn't like?
I don't know. I guess I'm thinking of like, for example, like the trauma-informed stuff, different ways they learned how to deal with that, or I guess to be fair, we talk to teachers in a lot of different traditions.
Yeah.
So maybe even just thinking about the Ashtanga teachers that we talked with. Yeah, I guess how does your experience of the teacher training more broadly, maybe, how does that maybe change the way you see some of the answers we got in the field? Or
Yeah, one of the things about I mentioned when I was putting on the PowerPoint, the teacher training, that it's essentially controlled by or it's sort of authorized by the Yoga Alliance, which is a big American company, that if you want to have your yoga teacher training taken seriously, you need to have it kind of approved by this body. So what I got interested in is the way in which these yoga teacher training programs, if they want to be taken seriously by the Yoga Alliance, and therefore you get your little RYT 200 certificate, you have to, you are in some sense being professionalized according to a guild or a kind of a national or international standard. Just as we would in, you when you're getting your PhD in anthropology, there are certain expectations your supervisors have. I know some of them who, they have certain expectations about how proficient you'll be in this language or that language or this fieldwork method or whatever. So I got quite interested in it as a professionalization context, and it certainly turned out that way. And certainly by the end of it, by the time our teacher walked us through the process, I felt different and kind of ready to share.
And do you think it changed your practice in any way as well, or any of this? Did it change in any way your yoga practice?
I don't think the TT changed my practice. It deepened it just because I did 200 extra hours in a few months. But I don't think it changed my practice so much as it certainly thickened my analysis of the way these professionalization processes work.
And part of it, from what I recall, was a bit of it's a fieldwork tactic in the sense of it was kind of an in for you as another layer of insiderness to say, oh yeah, I'm going to do one too. And then doors open in a way that they might not have had you not taken the teacher training.
Absolutely. That's a really great point, Rach, because, when you're doing fieldwork, especially when the people you're interviewing are strangers to you, you're not interviewing other people in your university class, but you have to find some way to build a bridge with them. Mm-hmm. And, I was really glad that the yoga that really kind of grabbed me was Ashtanga, because going into most yoga contexts, if you say you're an Ashtangi and you have a traditional Mysore style practice, everybody kind of takes that seriously. It's like saying, well, I'm really into exercise, and you say, well, I train for the Ironman. I'm automatically going to say, wow, okay, so that gets my foot in the door, because people in the yoga scene take the Ashtanga tradition seriously. But then the TT to say, yeah, I'm doing this in a couple months after field work, they kind of went, okay, so he's actually fairly serious. So that, I think that helped as a tactic. A tactic is not the wrong way to put it, but it just did. I could feel people kind of go, okay, yeah.
I have another question if I can jump in,
Can I, please?
So it's related to the trauma narratives, but it's also related to the situatedness of the project in North America. And so when you're talking about modern postural yoga, it's really modern postural yoga in North America. And what I want to bring up as an example or a thing to kind of tease out is this idea around like the conversion narrative or trope, right? Basically, this horrible thing happened to me. Yoga changed my life. Now I need everybody else to know that yoga changed my life and it can change your life too, right? Which is so North American evangelical Christian language. And I actually, in the field, when we were chatting with a bunch of yoga teachers, kind of called that out in the conversation, and all of them kind of looked at me like, huh? And I was like, well, that's really Christian language about like conversion, and this happened to me and how great, and now it can happen to you. And they were all like, huh? Except for one who had taken religious studies, who was like, that's totally true. So I was wondering if you could reflect, because I know in the book you refer to these things as kind of conversion narratives. So can you talk about how that reflects on the trauma, but also on the situatedness of MPY, like in North America?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. I mean, personally, for example, I know that I have to be careful when people say, how did you get into yoga? And say, oh, here we go. I can almost sort of press play and then I can tell the story. And it does have this kind of amazing grace quality to it. I was blind, but now I can see. that sort of quality to it. And certainly in the field, we did meet people who just, because let's not forget, to be a yoga teacher, A, it requires a lot of discipline. B, you could do other things. Because C, the money is terrible.
Yeah.
If you're an ambitious, attractive, physically capable, usually white woman in her mid-30s, a yoga career is a very difficult decision. So that's why I think the decision to give your life to being a yoga teacher is often a decision that needs to be storied in a specific way. And often that's where it gets its religious quality too, I think. Because people have to say, well, yes, I could be a lawyer, or I could be an accountant or a school teacher, and I'd make much more money than I'm making here, and I wouldn't have scrambled to make ends meet. But the reality is I had this car accident or this trauma experience, and this thing is why I can walk again. And I happen to know that virtually everybody I meet on the street has some kind of trauma history. And if I didn't give that to them, what kind of a person would I be? Right? So there was that in the fieldwork for sure. And it was sort of a way people, I think, made sense of the very difficult choices they made to give their lives to yoga, because it's a very difficult life on a financial level.
Yeah, I'll add that. I mean, even when I interview Christians who practice yoga, there's kind of the two different conversion pieces. There's the Christian conversion, and then there's the, injury, the whatever,
Yeah.
and then the sort of, coming to light of beginning to practice yoga.
So did they connect their trauma experience to Christianity and yoga then simultaneously?
Not necessarily. I mean, you hear a lot of different stories, but those two pieces are often different. I mean, often it's people who've been Christians for their whole lives, and then, but had some other issue, trauma, whatever, that then yoga filled a gap that was otherwise empty.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And my interest on this gap filling question has to do with, what gaps exist in our society that yoga is also filling.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the things that really took us into the field, was this question of the healthcare differences between Canada and the United States. And a person who has a trauma history, and that trauma has landed in their bodies, and they've got arthritis or eczema or whatever kind of difficult situation which they believe reflects their trauma. If the healthcare scenarios in both countries are very difficult, and it's difficult in terms of accessibility here and accessibility and cost in the United States, is yoga then this kind of alternative access to health and wellness that the state or the corporations can't or aren't providing? So that was a kind of a core question, and that still haunts me, because of course, like a lot of naive Canadians, I mean, you're an American, Leah's an American, and so she wasn't surprised at all, but we just kept having interview after interview where Americans just matter of factly would tell horror stories, well, what I consider to be horror stories about their healthcare. And it was always important for me to try to find a link between that story they're telling about their excellent health coverage, which nonetheless is terrible for them, and their turn to yoga. So
we're going to turn to the audience now, so we can open it up and get questions in the room. And if you have questions on Zoom, again, please message them to Scott, and he will wave our way to let us know. So yeah, we'll start with Devyani.
So firstly, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm personally interested in it being a yogini. So as a student, as a teacher. So my first question is, I was just curious why you chose yoga as a forum for testing questions of politics, of like strong, deep political questions. I was quite curious about that. That's my first question. The second is the personal is political, and to what extent your Indian heritage influenced this research project. And the third question is
Just a minor question.
That's the last question. Now, stories about asanas. Now, do they have to be, if I'm a yoga teacher, which I am, do they have to be now accompanied with trigger warnings? Is that the new trauma-informed teaching that you're talking about?
wow. Okay, I'll try to. Thank you. Those are great questions, and I expected them to be great. So thanks very much. So the first question was about, remind me, because they were.
Why choose yoga as a forum for testing political?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think of myself as being really very interested in the counterintuitive. So often people will talk about yoga spaces and yoga practice as being really just about me and my little body issues or my own, private spiritual development. They'll talk about it that way. And I'm suspicious of all talk like that, talk that privatizes experience, talk that minimizes your social realities or political realities. And so I thought, well, you know what, if you can find political forces in a yoga space, then that's just another reminder that all spaces are political. And again, to be clear to the people in the room and the people on Zoom, by political, I don't mean bad spaces. I just mean they're complicated spaces that are informed by your race, class, gender, ethnicity, financial status, whatever. So yeah, I was curious about that. And I also, to be honest, I went into a yoga studio to manage my own physical crisis. I had very severe arthritis. And I really just went for a sort of indically flavored physiotherapy. I had a friend who recommended I do it. He's sitting here. Scott is the one who got us all into this room. Seriously, I had this physical collapse, and I came to work, and as one does, one complains to one's coworkers about how much pain and suffering one is experiencing. And Scott said, "Why don't you try yoga?" And I thought, oh, I don't want to be that guy who comes to the West Coast. Right? The tattoos, the kayak, the whole thing. And so, yeah, and I didn't want to be the yoga guy either. So, but I became the yoga guy thanks to Scott. But when I went there, again, it was really just to sort out my joints. And, but you don't have to be there for very long before you start seeing other patterns, some of which are patterns that took me in spiritual direction, patterns thinking about what is suffering, how to overcome suffering, what is the self, how to manage self and universe relationships. But the other patterns you start to notice is, why are there so many nice cars in the parking lot? Why are these all mostly white women? Why are people speaking in Sanskrit who don't read or understand Sanskrit? What is the relationship between this studio and other studios in the same lineage, the Ashtanga lineage? So then I began to look at those other patterns. And so it became just a way to think about it. And I really resisted that, to be honest, because I didn't want to wreck it. It was going so well for me and on the physical level and then on the spiritual level. I didn't want to wreck it by scratching the surface and asking about gender and politics, economics. But but then I did. In our field, you can't not, it seems to me.
Can you answer the next two quickly?
Yes. Your last question is about
trigger warning.
Trigger warning. Yeah, trigger. So that question of what to do in a yoga space, especially after what we learned in the yoga's Me Too period, that resulted in most yoga studios having consent cards that people would take, and it's a yes or a no if you want physical adjustments. You put that by your mat. In many spaces, those have now gone, or no one uses them in many spaces. And I think that, something like a trigger warning or something like do you want to be touched? Are you okay with an adjustment is asked by most teachers now. And they're much more attuned to these concerns since Me Too. So, and you asked about my Indian heritage.
Yeah, actually, about the stories about asana, what I asked was, before teaching an asana, do I say, okay, trigger warning, blah, 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 this, before telling the story about the asana, rather than not touching, but like just I'm telling the story about the asana. And I say, okay, trigger warning, the way our society.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but of course, there's so many asanas, the sort of literal meaning of them and their implementation in the body are, like knee pressure pose or trikonasana, triangle pose. That wouldn't require a trigger warning because you're just talking about angles of limbs and muscles. But those ones that have kind of an Indic or a Hindu origin or set of meanings, I think people would be reluctant to share that. And maybe not a trigger warning would be needed, but some kind of broader context is useful to paint, I think.
I think we'll go to a Zoom question just so we can bring them into the room, and then we'll come back to the room.
Sure. This is from Jeff Lichty, who's
there
from the beginning. So he was saying, your asana practice has moved you into more, has it moved you into more stillness and potentially meditation? There was a physical change, but in your experience, has it been spiritual as well?
What a great question. So Jeff, so when Scott insisted that I try yoga, he didn't insist, he suggested. And when I walked up the stairs to my first yoga class, it was Jeff Lichty I met on the other side of the doors. And I was very fortunate to have met him. And so Jeff's been my teacher for about a decade. And so, yes, I think it has allowed me to develop more stillness. And my meditation practice is not very good. I see myself every morning as doing a kind of a moving meditation. So I don't make a sharp distinction between a meditative practice and an internal still meditative practice and a flowing asana-based meditative practice, although certainly many people do. I mean, I feel like I handle issues way differently than I used to, thanks to many of the things I learned from Jeff, but also thanks to what I think the practice delivers on its own.
Gary.
Thanks. I was just wondering how or whether you had to draw distinctions between styles of yoga in the study, because to my mind, there's quite a world of difference between like your run-of-the-mill hatha class and a Kundalini class. And I'm always a little bit surprised that Kundalini classes are as popular as they are. And speaking of trigger warnings, I mean, there's a class that needs something much more robust than a trigger warning because they're very difficult. They can have very strange effects on the nervous system.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, was that part of the study?
Yes, it absolutely definitely was. I think of them, these different styles, as sort of different denominations, as one would find in Christianity. And certainly, I mean, I think the one, Lee and I went to one in Winnipeg that was at a fitness club. And it was the most, as it were, secular of all the styles. And many of our Ashtanga ones were the most, as it were, religious. And yet even in the Winnipeg one, I talked to the guy beforehand. He said, "Oh no, this is totally just exercise. You're not going to find any spiritual or any of that stuff here." I said, "Sure." And that's fine. Like I just wanted to go through the motions with him, literally. But nonetheless, the beginning and the ending and the tone of voice and the lighting and the reference to the names of the postures had all this stuff still there. So even the ones that really are on the sort of exercise end of the spectrum don't, in my view, they're not divorced from the ones that are more like Kundalini or Ashtanga. So I prefer to see them as a spectrum. In the same way that, you know, going into a United Church in suburban Etobicoke versus going into a Russian Orthodox church in Russia, those are still called Christianity, but boy, they look different.
Yeah.
And I think it's useful to try to ask about how that happens. What is it about the national, regional space that makes them look so different?
Okay, back to the Zoom audience, and then John, you'll go next.
This question's from John Tatamanal. I'm wondering about how Paul's own status as an insider has changed as a result of this research. Has it? What does he learn from being an insider that cannot be learned by this kind of sociological research? Are these outsider questions present during practice? If not, presumably you are an insider during practice and an outsider before and after.
Some of you know John Tatamanal, and you can always trust him to deliver a really complicated question. So thanks, John, and lovely to see you on Zoom. So I'm trying to think of how to respond to that question. I mean, I don't know what it would have been like to do this project as a full outsider. I mean, maybe I do, because many of the other projects I've done have been as a full outsider. But even the Cascadia research project, I'm a Cascadian, I suppose, and so I love this place, and I wrote the book as a person who loves this place, and so the love, I think, is a feature of the analysis. I don't see a fondness or an affection or an emotional experience of the phenomenon I'm studying as being, you know, that's a kind of data in my view, and my experience of my yoga practice is itself a kind of data. You know, when I'm talking to other students, it's clear that me treating that as data can be somewhat threatening or irritating, and so I have to mind my manners about how often I talk about the sort of bigger questions I'm having or the sociological questions I'm having. So it's changed both the way I am an outsider and both the way I am an insider.
which is common in this sorts of things. We have so many insider and outsider identities, and they are on spectrums all the time and shift depending on where we are and whatever the case may be. So John, next, please. Go ahead.
Right. Thank you, Paul, for a very interesting and provocative presentation. And we'll maybe continue some of this tomorrow during our coffee talk. But I'm just wondering, in your interviews with all the teachers and the students and the survey that you did, do you find any sort of a allure to India as the source of yoga? That, you know, we're doing our yoga now here in North America, but if I really get serious about it, that's where I need to go to do a serious major practice.
Yeah.
I mean, we see this in Vipassana meditation and Zen meditation and Tibetan meditation to a certain degree, going to India and all that. So do you see a similar pattern in the yoga groups?
Yeah, what a great question, John. I do, except my sense is that it's waning.
Oh,
And the argument I make in one of the chapters is that it's waning as a function of Me Too, where so many Indian gurus and so many people in Indic lineages were really manipulative of their mostly women students, and that has sort of smudged the sort of allure of India a little bit. And I think the debates around cultural appropriation have also made conscientious Westerners a bit more circumspect about how they might think about India. But also, I just think the third thing that I think actually changes this question of how India is framed is just that yoga has been rooted here quite a long time now. And so there are a lot of people who have a sense that it has Indic roots, and they have a sense that they could definitely develop their practice if they went to India, and that perhaps there's even a lineage home there. But you know, yoga's been here for so long that they're starting to think of it as fundamentally North American phenomenon with a history that it's useful to know the history, but it's no longer considered necessary for so many people. Certainly in the Ashtanga world, if you want to be called an Ashtanga teacher, if you want to be authorized as our friend Jeff is, you need to go to India. There's absolutely no other place you can get it. I don't just mean that's the best place to get it, it's the only place to get it. So the lineage is structured that way on purpose. So yeah, but I think that's waning a bit. Yeah, and I think actually that's one of the things Modi is somehow tuned into, is that he wants to make sure everyone remembers, don't just think this is from Akron, Ohio, right? We built this thing. And the yoga industry there, in other words, the tourism industry, which is tied to yoga pilgrimages, you could say, is an important feature of the economy. So they don't want to lose that either.
So we're running short on time, but I have a couple more questions in the room. So I'm going to get a quick one.
Wait till tomorrow if you
Okay.
prefer.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that very interesting presentation, although I do not have any questions today, but I just wanted to give my own sort of perspective, if I'm permitted to, with regards to the aspect of cultural appropriation and yoga, the politics of yoga, especially with regards to the Indian government. Coming to the cultural appropriation part, I do not agree with it. It is just it has been brought in probably just because of the politics of it. I feel that it is cultural appreciation because we exchange so much. The idea of gymming, which came from the West, has been incorporated in the Indian cultural or in the Indian society. And if at every corner we've got in big cities we've got a gym, and we really appreciate that. So it's just a cultural exchange or a cultural appreciation. And I just want to take you back 5,000 years ago. Maharishi Patanjali, he had penned Yoga Sutras sitting in the holy city of Rishikesh on the banks of holy river Ganga. And ever since then, the Yoga Sutras have touched, I think, and I feel strongly that they've touched every shore, every corner of the world. And because the ideology of Hinduism is just one earth, one family, which is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and yoga is absolutely secular in the nature. There is nothing to do with politics. It is completely secular, whether it's being practiced by a Westerner or a Hindu or a Muslim. There is no imposition of Hindu ideology or Hindu theory in it. That's my understanding of it. And as far as the Indian government is concerned, or the Modi government, I'm not a spokesperson, but of course I do support them in a lot of ways. When he redefined yoga by giving it a name of International Yoga Day, just to extend what Maharishi had probably thought so many years ago. And yes, of course, tourism, why not? There's so much to explore in the country. Probably that was there, the economics of it was there, but he just extended it, and there was nothing to do with imposing the Hindu ideology, as I just said. It's just an expansion to encompass the entire world, because Maharishi Patanjali probably at that time had just seen the human body and the human soul when he penned the Yoga Sutras. It wasn't meant for a particular community or just restricted to a particular community. It's meant for the entire human race. That's it.
Wow.
Thank you.
That's a beautiful sermon. And no, and not a bad way to end.
No, it's
because
just
what
it's
you
just my understanding of it.
No, that's fine. What
Politics
you-
are, of course, a part of, as you've just mentioned.
Yeah.
Politics are part of
The
it.
way you've articulated it is so much, in some ways, it encapsulates some of the complexities of the category of yoga, the historical phenomenon of yoga, what people do with it here, what people in India do with it in order to, for a whole variety of small p and capital P political aims. I think it's hard to imagine the Yoga Sutras as secular, personally, but we have to perhaps have a longer conversation about what we mean by secular. If you mean non-sectarian Hindu, or like non-specifically capital H Hindu, that's fine. That category didn't really exist when Patanjali wrote the Yoga Sutras, so it wouldn't have made any sense to him to say that it was or wasn't Hindu, because Hinduism wasn't a thing then. He had a different objective when he compiled the text. But we can have another conversation, I think, about this question of what is and isn't meant by the early text. But thank you. It's not my expertise. My expertise is more like, what are people doing? What kind of language? And actually, you mentioned the 5,000 year history. That number is a very commonly used number.
It's just a generic number, which is just so that everybody can connect with it. That's all.
Right. And I mean, and so one of the things that fascinated me, because one of the first things you learn when you start doing, as it were, secular Western yoga studies, is that most of what we think of as postural yoga in the West, at least, is about 100 years old. Right. And yet every yoga teacher is told this 5,000 year number, which is that raises the question, what's going on there with that massive difference between, is it 100 years old or is it 5,000 years old? There's a kind of an imagination of India that is being invoked by that bigger number. And I just think that as religious studies scholars, it's our job to just take those claims seriously and then try to understand what they mean in the broader social political world.
Awesome. On that note, I think I'll just draw your attention to next week. We have Megan Pollinger here with us from the University of Ottawa, creating contact, bridging divides. So come and hear Megan's example of Scholars in the Square next week. And thanks so much to Paul and for all of your great questions this evening. Thanks for being here.
Yeah.